That's in Acts, the podcast where we dive into the wild, world-changing stories of the early church and ask all the questions you didn't know you had.
Hi, I'm Sharon Hobbs. I'm a teacher, a lover of all things scriptural, and I am so excited to have a conversation about Acts every week. Together, we'll explore the book of Acts, not as a dusty piece of history, but as a living, breathing story of God's power, his people, and his purposes. This is, wait, that's in Acts, where discovery meets faith and theology meets real life. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Wait, That's in Acts. I am coming to you today solo for chapter 12 because we had some technical difficulties as we recorded this with Tara and I. So I'm going to just walk through it, kind of read and talk through the passage. Okay. Now, this was probably in the spring of 42 or 43 AD when we are in Jerusalem and we see events have become pretty tense in Jerusalem. The Romans have begun a persecution against the Christians, and the Jewish believers have really divided themselves away from the sect that was once considered part of the Jewish religion, but now has become contrary to their beliefs, and therefore they no longer will provide any protection to the Christians. So it says in verse 1, "Now about the time that Herod the king laid hands on some of those who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword." Okay. This is a violent, when it says laid hands on, this is violently beginning this Roman persecution. And so the persecution is upon many of them, but particularly it is focused on the apostles. So he arrested James. We don't have any really details about this. And I think that's kind of interesting that in the scriptures, this is really the only mention of this event where he gets the brother of John, James, and he puts him to death by beheading him with the sword. So I think maybe this was taking the church by surprise. But really, if you think about it, Jesus had already told the apostles that this was going to happen, that they were going to suffer the same kinds of persecution and death, even crucifixion, that he himself had suffered. In Mark 10:38 and 39, it says, Jesus is talking to his disciples. And this is actually when James and John had come with their mother to Jesus, asking for the positions on his right and left hand in the kingdom. And he told them eventually, it's not my place to give. But before that, he speaks these words, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism in which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized." So that was a prophetic warning to them that they too would have to suffer the persecution and eventual death. And we know from history that every one of the apostles, except John, were actually martyred for Jesus Christ. John died on the Isle of Patmos, being banished, because when they tried to kill him, they couldn't. They actually tried to boil him in oil, and he survived. And so they put him on a prison island, the island of Patmos, and he was the only one who did not suffer a martyr's death, although he suffered great persecution in their attempts to kill him. Okay, so this beheading of James is second only to crucifixion in the Roman law. And we see that this is a common effort in this time period in Jerusalem. And it actually causes much of the Jerusalem church to be scattered out away from Jerusalem and spread the gospel. So God never wastes anything, and he did not waste this persecution against the Christians. This is also kind of a transitional chapter. Up until this time, we have been looking at the history of Peter as the leader, the primary apostle, and the spread of the gospel through the Jewish believers. Okay, we are getting ready to transition, and we've already kind of looked at it in Antioch, but now we're going to really transition to the missionary travels and the ministry of Paul, who was Saul and becomes Paul through that early missionary process. So this wraps up the history of Peter and kind of transitions over to the history of Paul, and he becomes the focus for the rest of the book of Acts. Verse 3 of this chapter 12 says, when they saw that it pleased the Jews, so Agrippa, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, and this is actually pleasing the Jewish elite that were the authorities and the influence in the Jewish synagogues, Agrippa was always trying to stay popular with the Jewish elite. His Roman status was pretty shaky as a governor, and he needed the support and the peace-keeping powers of the Jewish people, especially the Jewish elite who influenced all of the Jewish synagogues and the Jewish religion. So he is always currying favor with the Jewish elite. He proceeds to arrest Peter also, and now it was the days of the unleavened bread. This is actually the same timing as the death of Jesus. In other translations, it says, now when he saw that it had pleased the Jews. Why was it now? Because now the Jews were really rejecting this sect of the Jesus followers that originally had been called the Way, and they were originally by the Romans particularly, and even by most of the Jews, considered a sect of the Jewish religion. And the Jewish religion had some certain coverage or protections from the Romans. But now the Jews are entirely rejecting these Christ followers. And so they are no longer supporting them, no longer covering them, and therefore Agrippa sees that, oh, now I can curry favor because I can persecute these Christian followers. Why was that? Why was it now that the Jews were rejecting them? Probably because now we see that they have begun to minister and reach out and accept Gentile believers. And so the Jewish believers of Christ are no longer considering themselves separate, apart from, or divided from the Gentiles. And that was absolutely contrary to the Jewish elite and the Sanhedrin's beliefs. So now they have entirely rejected this sect or this way, and they no longer want to be associated with these Christian believers at all. Verse 4, when he had seized him, Peter, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So these 4 squads, a squad was 4 soldiers, and they had rotating shifts. So there were 4 soldiers at any given time responsible for keeping Peter in chains and in bondage. Okay. And these Roman soldiers, they knew that if they let something happen to Peter, then it was their necks. They were going to suffer the same sentence that Peter had been given. So the sentence that Peter had been given was death. All right. So these Roman soldiers knew that if something happened to Peter, then they were going to suffer that same death that Peter was scheduled to suffer. So you know that these 4 soldiers were very diligent. They were not going to be sleeping on the job. They were going to be making sure that one another was all covering their positions and their jobs. So their positions were that they chained Peter between 2 of them. Now that's a little unusual because usually a prisoner was chained only to one soldier. But here we see double precautions. They chained them between 2 soldiers, and then they stationed 2 soldiers outside of the cell or the inner room that they were keeping Peter in. So he was kept in the most secure center part of the prison, probably in Antonia, chained between 2 soldiers, and then 2 soldiers standing at guard at the door of that prison cell. And then there were, of course, other guards at other locations in the prison. So there's an inner chamber, then there's a bigger chamber, and then there is a courtyard or a exercise yard maybe, and then the gate before you get to the city. So there's a lot of security to go through to get out from where Peter was chained between these 2 soldiers. We see that Agrippa here is keeping him chained and secure until after this feast is over. The feast is actually a 7-day celebration. And the reason that he is not doing this execution during this festival is because that was abhorrent to the Jews. It was an offense to defile the festival with this execution. So he's keeping Peter until the end of the 7-day and until the Passover day has been completed. And then he's going to make a great display of this execution. Verse 5, so Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. So this is an extended intercession during these 7 days. These were days of fasting and preparation for the feast of the Passover anyway. And so they were meeting and they were taking time out. They probably had an ongoing, all the time prayer meeting that people would come and go. So, verse 6, on the very night, so they'd been doing this through this probably entire 7 days. And on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, so after the end of the festival, Peter was going to be brought out the next day. And it says Peter was sleeping between the two soldiers that he was chained to, bound with two chains, and the guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. So I think it's interesting that Peter is sleeping. He's not awake. He is not worried. He is not earnestly interceding and praying all night. He has come to a place of peace. He has come to a place where he is trusting God, and he's saying, Lord, I'm in your hands. Whatever you choose for me, I accept that. Maybe he's even remembered that God had told him that he was going to suffer the same fate that Jesus had suffered. And so he's at peace with God. He is sleeping, and soundly sleeping, not just lightly sleeping, as we'll see here in a minute. Verse 7, and behold, an angel of the Lord appeared suddenly, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up, saying, get up quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. So he had to smite Peter, shake him, or strike him in order to wake him up. That's how soundly he was sleeping. You think about you waking up from a dead sleep, and you're kind of disoriented, and here's this vision, this angel, this, I don't really know what's happening. There's whole light in the prison where it should be completely dark. And we see that his chains just fall off. So he's, I think, disoriented. He's confused. And we don't know what happened to the guards. We don't know if they were struck blind, if they were supernaturally put asleep, knocked out. We don't really have that story, but they were entirely unaware of the event that happened until morning. Had they been aware, they would have immediately, as soon as they could have possibly, roused an alarm and tried to go capture Peter back. But they did not know. They were unaware of this event happening. So the angel says to him in verse 8, gird yourself, put on your sandals. And he did so. And he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. So he's kind of disoriented, and this angel is instructing, okay, put your shoes on, get your clothes on, wrap your coat around yourself, and come with me. And he went out and continued to follow, and he did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but he thought he was seeing a vision. He's seeing what's happening, but he can't perceive that this is physically actually happening. He feels like he's seeing this vision. And when he had passed the first and the second guard, so he went out of his cell and past those two guards, past the next set of guards, and then up to the gate, or the actual door entrance from the courtyard out into the city. And it tells us that they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened for them by itself. So it just swung open, and they walked out, not stopped by anyone at any of these three checkpoints, in the middle of the night. with guards at every one of them. They went out and went along one street and probably turned a corner, and immediately the angel departed from him. Poof, he was gone. Now Peter actually comes to himself and realizes that it is not a dream, not a vision. And we see that Peter was not expecting this supernatural rescue. He comes to himself, verse 11, and he says, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." So he didn't really expect this supernatural event. He was not praying that God send an angel and set me free. He was just expecting God to do whatever God chose to do. But when he comes to himself in the middle of the city and he realizes this, verse 12, he then went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who is also called Mark. So John Mark likely was a house church that Peter regularly attended or maybe ministered at, where many were gathered together and were praying. So he comes up to this house, and we see that this is a wealthy family, probably a pretty good-sized house. They have a courtyard. They have a door, probably complete wooden door at the entrance of this courtyard, and the courtyard has probably a brick wall that surrounds it. And he knocks at the door of the gate, it says, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Now we know that this is a wealthy home because they have this enclosed courtyard, and they have a servant girl, probably a young child, who is assigned to answer all knocks at the outer door. So she comes out to this knock, and Peter says to her, "Open the door," probably. And she hears his voice, and maybe she even asks, "Who's there?" And he says, "It's Peter." And she recognizes his voice, and she is astounded. She is excited, and she's a young child. So she couldn't see him, but she recognized his voice. She knew who it was, and she ran back into them to say, "Peter's at the gate, Peter's at the gate." Because of her joy, verse 14, she did not open up the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. Now, did they believe this child? No. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept insisting or kept saying, "It's his angel." Now, if you understand the Jewish folklore of this time or literature, the belief that many of the Jews had at this time was that your guardian angel looked like you, sounded like you, was a almost physical representation of you. Okay? So it's logical that they would think that this is his angel. The guardian angel was believed to often appear to the family after the death of the one that they were assigned to or guarded or kept. So they're saying it's his angel. And in saying that, they might actually think, well, Herod's already killed him. That's probably what they're thinking. And now his angel is coming, appearing to us, and we'll find out that he has been killed like James had been killed. But Peter continues knocking. The knock doesn't stop. So somebody with a little more authority comes to open up the door, and they saw him and were amazed. And so they're amazed at the answer to their fervent prayers, right? They were praying earnestly, but they didn't have any expectation of this kind of supernatural release, right? James had already been killed. He hadn't been rescued. So they didn't have any guarantees that Peter was going to be released or rescued. And, often we assume like, oh, it'll be a release. It won't be some supernatural show up in the middle of the night kind of event. Verse 17, Peter motions to them with his hands to be quiet, to be silent, and he describes to them how the Lord had let him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James. Now, this James is the brother of Jesus, who is the leader or pastor of the Jerusalem church. So James probably wasn't there in the middle of the night at this prayer meeting. And he's telling these that are at the meeting, okay, I am going to have to leave town. I'm going to have to get out of here because, they're looking for me. But I want you to go and tell James and tell all of the brethren or all of the disciples and apostles what happened to me. And I am going to go find a place of safety. So it says, then he left and went to another place. Now remember that Peter and John, had been arrested and been released miraculously out of the grip or out of the prison. It's not the same prison, but a jail cell that the Sanhedrin had put them in when they were preaching in the temple. Now, when that happened, they were released by the angel, but the angel said to them, go back to the temple and preach again. And the guards came and found them the next morning preaching again in the temple. That was a different situation than this kind of situation. Then they were still being protected in a manner, and they had not yet come under this Roman persecution. Now, with this great Roman persecution, Peter understands that God wants him to leave Jerusalem. So he goes away from Jerusalem. Now, we will find in chapter 14 that he returns to Jerusalem probably after the death of Agrippa, because after the death of Agrippa, this persecution kind of lessens against the Christians. So that'll be in Acts chapter 15. But right now, he is going to get out of town. Now, verse 18, when the day had come, there was no small disturbance in the prison, right, among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. He just, in their understanding, disappeared, right? They became aware in the morning and he was gone. And there was nothing they could do about it. Verse 19, when Herod had searched for him and had not found him. So now we have all of the soldiers searching for him, but also Herod searching for him. Then Herod comes back, Agrippa, and he examines the guards. So he talks to all of them, asks them what happened. Where is he? What did you do? Were you sleeping? What was the deal? Right? They had no answer for him. And he orders that they be led away to execution. So they did suffer the fate that was meant for Peter. And after he executed these guards, and he had kind of set up the elite Jewish Sanhedrin to expect that they were going to see the death of Peter, Agrippa decides it's time to get out of town. And it says, then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. So we know that Caesarea is the kind of Roman capital city, right? So he leaves Judea, where the Sanhedrin are and where the Jews might be upset that all of a sudden they expected the death of Peter, but Peter's nowhere to be found. And Agrippa's not producing him and not following through on his word. So Agrippa kind of gets out of town and goes back down to the capital city. So I think that's really interesting that he is now avoiding the Jewish elite because his plan failed, right? So that's probably a good place that we're going to leave Herod down in Caesarea, and we will see in our next session what happens to Herod after this event. So until next week, I pray blessings upon you and hope that you have a great week.
Well, that wraps up today's episode of Wait, That's an Acts, where I ask the questions and Sharon brings the theology.
And together we uncover just how wild, surprising, and inspiring the book of Acts really is.
If you learned something new, laughed a little, or had one of those, wait, that's in there moments, share this episode with a friend.
And you can find more conversation, notes, and upcoming topics wherever you get your podcasts.
Until next time.
Keep asking questions. Keep discovering the God who is better than you.